Next, let's look at the inheritance of blood groups. Human blood types are an example of a trait that's controlled by multiple alleles. There are 3 alleles that will control this trait in humans. We use I to annotate these alleles. So you have I with an uppercase superscript A, and then an I with a superscript B, and then a lowercase I. So the 2 uppercase I's are the 2 dominant alleles. So this is an example of codominance because they are both expressed in an individual if you have both of those alleles. And then the lowercase I is the recessive allele. The reason this matters is because if you have one of the dominant alleles, then what that means is that you're going to have a certain protein or a certain antigen that is expressed on the red blood cell. Antigens are what our body recognizes as foreign substances, and that's what causes allergic reactions. So if you have antigen A on your red blood cell, and then someone gives you a blood transfusion with an antigen B on the red blood cell, so a type B blood, then you're going to have an allergic reaction to that because your body's going to recognize it as foreign. It's going to recognize that it's not the normal type of antigen that it usually sees on the red blood cell, and it's going to have a bad allergic reaction whenever that blood gets into your system. So it is quite important from a medical standpoint to know what your blood type is, and they always test that before they give you a transfusion. If there isn't time, they usually give you type O blood, because type O blood has 2 recessive alleles, and so there are no antigens in that blood. Alright, so let's look at the 6 different options for genotypes with the ABO blood system. So you've got type A blood, and there are 2 ways you could have type A. You could have 2 dominant alleles, or you could have a dominant and a recessive allele. Same thing for type B. You could have 2 dominant alleles, or you could have a dominant and a recessive allele. If you have 2 dominants of 2 different types, then you end up with type AB. And then if you have the 2 recessives, you're type O. So the first question has to do with inheritance, and there's a child, and showing kind of what the different blood types the parents could be. So the question is it possible for a child with blood type AB to be produced by 2 type O parents? Show your work with a Punnett square and then explain. So I went ahead and filled in the parents are going to be both type O, which means they're going to have both recessive alleles, which means that all of the children are going to have recessive alleles as well. So 2 type O parents will only produce type O children. So that means the answer is no, you cannot have an AB child from 2 O parents. And the reason for this is that there are no dominant alleles for them to pass on to their children. For a child to be AB, they've got to have both dominant alleles, both a dominant A and a dominant B, and type O parents don't have any of those. They don't have any dominant alleles to pass on. Now the next question is, in a case of disputed paternity, the child is type O, the mother is type B. So we know that the child did in fact come from this mother, so the genotypes of the mother and child can be determined. If the child is O, then they've got 2 recessive alleles, which means they had to have gotten at least one of those recessive alleles from the mother. So if the mother is type B, we've got 2 options for type B. We've got 2 dominants to make type B, and then a dominant and a recessive to make type B. Well, obviously it's got to be the second one, the dominant and the recessive, because she passed on a recessive to her child. So we know then that the mother has the genotype of 1 dominant with a B and 1 recessive allele. So now you're going to use Punnett squares to determine which, if any, of the following blood types could be the father. The first one's done as an example. So the first one is a type O male crossed with our type B mother that we already know her genotype and how that Punnett square works out. So in this example, you've got 4 possible outcomes, and 2 of those you have a type O child. So yes, he could be the father, is kind of the answer to that. Let's look at this one. In this one, you've got a type A male, and so I went ahead and remember for type A, we've got 2 options. We've got either 2 dominants or a dominant and a recessive, but we know that for there to be any chance of there being a type O child, there's got to be a recessive in there somewhere. So I went ahead and picked the recessive combination for this Punnett square. So in the type A heterozygous individual that's the father, and the type B heterozygous individual that's the mother, the possible outcomes for the children would be type AB. We could also do a type B. Over here we've got a recessive allele from the mom and a dominant allele from the dad, so that would be a type A. And then the last combination is the recessive from the mom and the recessive from the dad, which would be a type O. So yes, there is one possible option out of these four where you could end up with a type O child. So a type A male could be the father. Type B is going to be quite similar. So I went ahead and did the same thing. I used the type B that has the recessive allele in it so that we'd have a chance potentially of a homozygous recessive offspring. So it's going to be very similar to this type A over here. So you've got one combination where it's type B because it got the dominant allele from both the mom and the dad. You've got another type B where it's one recessive and one dominant. Type B again, same thing, one recessive, one dominant. And then the last combination is the two recessive alleles, one from each of the parents. So in this example, you do have an option where you could have a type O child, a 25% chance. So yes, this man could be the father. And then the last one is type AB. So for type AB, we've only got one option, only one genotype. You've got to have two dominant alleles. So you can probably guess what's going to happen here when you cross the mother with her one recessive and then the father with the two dominants. But let's go ahead and finish out the square. So the first child's going to inherit both dominant alleles of the two different types. So this would be an AB child. The second child's going to get both of the dominant B alleles. So that would be a type B child. The third child's going to get one recessive from the mom, but is still going to get a dominant A from the dad. So that would be a type A child. And then the last one's getting the recessive from the mom, but another dominant from the dad. So that would be a type B child. So what that means is no option here where you could have a type O child. So a heterozygous mom for type B with a type AB dad is not going to make any type O children. So the answer for this one is no, he could not be the father. Now obviously this is not all you'd have to do to determine parental whether or not a child came from certain parents. Obviously DNA typing is probably going to be a little bit safer and a little bit better of an option, but this is an interesting way to look at it as well. Alright, let's do another cross. What are the possible blood types with a heterozygous type A father, so I filled that in, heterozygous type A, and a heterozygous type B mother. So remember, we had this listed up at the beginning. I listed all the different options. So heterozygous type A is a dominant A and then a recessive. Heterozygous type B will be a dominant B and a recessive. So I put those in the square. So let's look at our outcomes. So the first one gets both dominants. This child is going to get the dominant from the mom and the recessive from the dad. This child will get the recessive from the mom and the dominant from the dad. And then this last child is going to get a recessive from each parent. This is a very interesting combination. So we've got 4 different blood types. We've got type AB, so this first child that has one of each of the dominants. We've got type B, we've got type A, and we've got type O. And we have one of each. So that is a 25% chance, or a 25% outcome for each of these different blood types in this cross. And the ratio would be 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. So you've got an equal percentage or an equal chance to have each of these different blood types. Cross number 2, is it possible to produce a type O baby from a type A father and a type O mother? All right, we've kind of done this before, but the type O mother would have the 2 recessive alleles. For type A father, we can either have 1 dominant and 1 recessive, which is the one I picked, so we'd have at least a chance with that recessive allele. Or you could have 2 dominant A's. But if you have 2 dominant A's, you can do a Punnett square. You'll see that you have no possible outcome where you could have 2 recessives, because the dad would be contributing both dominants. But in this heterozygous individual, there is a recessive to donate to a child. So let's do the Punnett square and just kind of prove that. So in this cross, we've got half of the children are type A, and half the children are type O. So yes, it is possible to produce a type O baby from a type A father and a type O mother. So he could be the father, but as we discussed before, that alone is not evidence. You'd have to do more testing, like DNA testing, to determine if he was in fact the father.